We're excited to be joined now by Washington Post reporter Jeff Stein, who has been all over this story. Jeff, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, guys.
As we start, I want to get your reaction to this clip. I'm sure you've seen it by now, but of Donald Trump on the White House lawn yesterday, all his Teslas behind him, Elon Musk by his side, responding to a question about Doug Ford. Let's go ahead and roll B1.
Already Canada, and I respect very much. As you know, there's a very strong man in Canada who said he was going to charge a surcharge or a tariff on electricity coming into our country. He has called and he said he's not going to do that. Okay, he's not going to do that. And it would have been a very bad thing if he did. And he's not going to do that, so I respect that. But we were just informed that he's not going to do that.
So that's Trump referring to Ontario, Doug Ford of Ontario. And Jeff, I think that is, I don't know what actually happened there. Maybe you have a better idea of what actually happened between Trump and Doug Ford, a very strong man, as Trump says. But I guess it speaks to the complicated interpersonal dynamics that are affecting the tariffs overall as Trump negotiates with Canadian leaders. So do you have any insight into what went down?
I don't have the specific timeline on that call. We know for sure that the Canadians had threatened not just to raise the price of electricity for, roughly 1 million Americans, but to actually shut it off. And, what the, administration announced yesterday was that the doubling of the steel and aluminum tariffs that Trump had proposed from 25 to 50%, which would have been really bad for Canada. One of the top Canadian exports to the U.S. is steel. And had that gone into effect, it would have probably, invited the retaliation that Ford was alluding to. So it's a little hard to know exactly what the sequence was of this. And not to make excuses for my reporting gaps, but this is playing out across dozens, if not hundreds of countries right now trying to avoid the import duties, the massive, tariff taxes that Trump is imposing. And what reading between the lines, it seems what happened was the Trump people had been back channeling that this 25 to 50% hike on steel and aluminum was likely. And that came off yesterday back to 25% around the time that Trump announced that that Canada was not going to retaliate on American electricity, on the users in those northern states. But the degree to which this can just fly off the handle at any moment is pretty unnerving, especially if you're someone who needs, Canadian provided electricity.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, to kind of bring people up to speed, yesterday there was this back and forth between Trump and the Canadians. At the end of the day, Trump decided to roll back the things that had been threatened, but there are still other tariffs that are going into effect today. I mean, there are a lot of theories, Jeff, out there about what the hell Trump is up to. Like, is this really about reindustrializing the country? Because the approach doesn't really make sense for that. It's definitely not really about fentanyl. Like, I think we can all see through that's kind of ridiculous given the very small amounts of that drug that come from Canada. There have been some theories about how this is an attempt to actually do some sort of controlled demolition of the economy, both to keep inflation down and also to trigger interest rates being lowered so that a refinance on the Treasury debt will be more affordable. Trudeau certainly thinks that Trump is serious about using economic warfare to annex some or all of Canada. I've seen some other sort of like 8D chess type theories out there. The other, then there's more sort of like nefarious theories, like they just want to use these market spikes to insider trade and people are profiting off of it. Or they want to trigger a recession because guess what? Coming out of recessions, usually the rich people get even richer, the banks get even bigger. And given that the government is being run, effectively as like an oligarchy, maybe that's the end goal here is they actually want to generate a recession. Like, have you been able to come up with what is your theory of the case of what he's actually up to here with all of this?
Yeah, I mean, as a reporter, we sort of have the traffic in the facts we have. And while we should look very carefully to answer some of those questions that you're posing. I mean, is there insider trading going on? Are Trump's, allies or family profiting from the wild swings in the market that he seems to be just himself controlling? With, who knows if the DOJ is even investigating those carefully. While we have to take those issues seriously, I think it's worth saying that, Trump has been very clear for over a year now that he sees tariffs as able to do several different things. These things are in tension. He's sort of the most generous possible interpretation we can give him, I think, is that he views these goals, these separate goals for tariff policy, as sort of all worthwhile, but maybe not all worthwhile simultaneously, or maybe some can be accomplished and others can't, and that's okay. So just to back up and try to explain this a little more clearly, Trump has said, I think, really, really importantly to understanding Trump's motives, that from his perspective, the U.S. is getting screwed by the existing state of trade barriers, where they believe, with some reason we can get into why this is more complicated than they say, but that other countries have far higher import duties on our exports than we do on theirs. So that's clearly a goal, I think. But there's also the goal of, can we raise revenue? Because we know that the Republicans are trying to pass $4 trillion in tax cuts. And Trump is not wrong that if you impose massive taxes on every import coming to the U.S., even though it would be devastating for a lot of poor Americans who depend on imports for cheap food and other necessities, it could raise a lot of money. Now, these two things don't mesh together. Either the tariffs are a vehicle to lower import duties, in which case you reach a deal where the U.S. tariffs come off, or they're a tool to raise lots of revenue to pay for the tax cuts, and in which case they stay on. It cannot be both. And so, be as generous as I can be as possible to Trump, there is just an incompatibility here. Maybe what he's thinking is, if I do this and it doesn't work, at least we get the revenue. And if I do this and then they lower the trade barriers on our exports, I'll take that win instead. That's the most reasonable assumption I think you could possibly make, being as generous as possible to the president. For all the reasons you're alluding to, Krystal, there's been a lot of questions about how even with the president's own goal, this doesn't make sense because, right, like he says, 25% tariff on Mexico, let's say, on all goods. And then like 3 hours later, it's like, no, it's not on, it's off, it's on, it's blah, blah, blah. And that is incompatible with this idea of we're going to impose these tariffs to bring domestic manufacturing and production and factories back to the U.S. I've talked to a number of business leaders, executive CEOs in the last few days who have said, look, like if Trump just said, like, this is the tariff policy, even if we didn't like it, even if we thought it was too high, we could like do something around it. But it's not just that they don't know if the tariffs are going to come off. They also don't know if the tariffs are going to stay on. So the uncertainty in both directions is crippling. And I know that was a rambling answer, but hopefully give you some sense of where I'm seeing this.
Yeah, it's actually so helpful. And let's run through a couple of elements that relate to what Jeff just said. If we put the CNBC tariff sheet on the screen, this is B2. This is about just what happened yesterday. The headline is sort of amusing. Trump will not impose 50% Canadian steel aluminum tariffs tomorrow, says top trade advisor. And this is a quote from Peter Navarro to CNBC yesterday afternoon. And CNBC writes, quote, the reversal came 6 hours after Trump announced his plan to double import duties on the Canadian metals in response to Ontario's decision to slap a 25% tax on electricity exports to the U.S. And then if we put B3 up on the screen, this is more news about Canada. Canada files to sell USD bonds, size undisclosed. That's again from yesterday. And finally, I want to put this Truth Social post from Trump on the screen, which is B4, which sees Trump asking, why would our country allow another country to supply us with electricity, even for a small area? Who made these decisions and why? And can you imagine Canada stooping so low as to use electricity, all caps, that so affects the life of innocent people as a bargaining chip and threat? They will pay a financial price for this so big that it will be read about in history books for many years to come. And I know Krystal wants to make a point about some of the decisions in Gaza on that. But before we do, Jeff, I want to get your reaction to just how we see different things coming from different people in the administration administration. The president is saying one thing. Peter Navarro is then talking to CNBC and saying something. There's this update that seems to contradict what's happening, according to the president. So I wonder just your sense from people who work on these issues in the White House, is that intentional? I mean, is it intentionally haphazard? Because that speaks to whether or not the uncertainty is itself intentional. And, you just kind of got into whether that would make sense for the end goal of the Trump administration. But I'm wondering, if it seems like they are purposefully causing confusion, or if there's genuinely a lot of confusion and there's nothing strategic about it.
I mean, I think if there is intentional confusion, it's going on between Trump's ears. Like it's not something that the advisors, according to the people I've talked to, like the people close to Trump are not excited about looking like, fools might be an overstatement, but looking uninformed on national television almost every day, having their exact utterances immediately contradicted by their boss, whose views they're supposed to be reflecting. But I think, as we're seeing not just here, but across, almost every issue, Trump is like, I won twice. The media hit me with everything. They tried to put me in jail or whatever, the Democrats, whatever conspiracy theories he has about that. And so he's unbowed and he's doing what he wants to do. And he seems, wholly unperturbed by the stock market, his approval ratings, his own advisors, America's closest allies, the fate of the American economy writ large. Like, none of these things seem to be really enough to move him. And that leaves us in a kind of a scary place, I think.
I wanted to get your opinion, Jeff, on whether that piece of information about Canada doing a sale of U.S. bonds, which is not an unusual thing to do, but a lot of people kind of were interested in the fact that that was happening. And this also comes as the Liberals in Canada have just elected a new leader, as the new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, who is himself a former central banker, both of Canada and actually of England, as Brexit was going on. So I wonder if you could reflect a little bit, just specifically on that development and more broadly on having Mark Carney in charge in Canada now and how that could impact the way that they respond.
Well, I mean, I actually hadn't seen that until you showed it. I think it reflects a really interesting question, though, which is the sort of Trump fusillade all-out attack on all of our global trading partners going to change the way the world views the safety and security of the U.S. dollar as the world's sort of reserve currency and sort of, the way that treasuries over the last 40, 50 years have served as the backstop, the trusted sort of foundation of the global financial system. And it is not inconceivable at all to me. And I don't know what the provenance of that tweet, and I should figure that out. But it's not at all inconceivable. I did check
it out that it was accurate. Yeah. I know that was like a random account, but it is accurate.
My only point there is that the U.S. has an enormous fiscal imbalance relative to most countries. And that deficit allows us to fund social services, not in the way that the Nordics do, but greater than our very, very, very low tax revenue allow us to do. And the U.S. is able to do that because we are able to lend money on global capital markets pretty cheaply, like much more cheaply than any other comparable country in the entire world. We have sort of this golden goose that allows us to print money, and we can debate whether that money is used well, but it has been a foundational feature of the American economy for 30, 40 years. And the idea that is at risk now is a very scary thing, because other countries could follow suit and stop buying U.S. debt, which could cause sort of the premiums that the U.S. has to offer on its debt to get investors to buy it to spike. And that would be something that would trigger a rise in borrowing costs that could lead to a crisis for the U.S. government very quickly. And it's something that we're tracking because it's a vulnerability as Trump sort of lashes out against the whole world simultaneously right now.
Yeah, because one of the theories that I've seen is that, normally in times of instability, there's a flight into U.S. bonds. Like that's sort of like, the bedrock gold standard of stability, because we're still sort of the global hegemon. And so when Canada, which now, Mark Carney, again, central banker, as their leader, like, we're actually going to do the opposite of that. We're going to sell. We're going to take at this moment to sell U.S. bonds. It's very possible people are reading too much into it. But it was an indication to me of like, this may not go the way that you think it's going to, because the country the world gets a say in how they respond as well. And, we are in this moment where there's a geopolitical rebalancing. And, I think some of the moves for the Trump administration certainly are aggressively trying to reshape that geopolitical balance in the way that they want it to appear. And so that's why I thought that was really noteworthy. And like you said, a potential warning sign. I mean, what do we mostly use that surplus and that incredible quote unquote golden goose to do? Is to have a gigantic military, and then to, have the social safety net programs like Medicare and Social Security and Medicaid that are really important to people. And I do think that is one of the profound risks of this moment, that and just, the de-dollarization, like moving away from the dollar as the global reserve currency.
There's a great article in Compact. I don't know if either of you read it, basically about the emergent ideological belief among like the Howard Lutniks, who's, by the way, a big backer of stablecoin, that Trump's approach to crypto is now actually, he's been sort of converted to the ideological school that crypto is something that boosts the dollar because stablecoin is pinned one-to-one to the US dollar. Therefore, all of this is actually sort of galaxy brain helpful to the United States. I don't know, Jeff, like what do you make of everything that Krystal just laid out?
Don't check the price of Bitcoin.
Yeah. Yep.
I mean, that tweet you put up is incredible, right? Like why would we trust the Canadians to sell us electricity? And I don't know. I mean, the 2024 presidential election, like I covered it, it was not about animus towards Canada. Trump was not running on destroying Ontario and encouraging Americans to boo the Canadian national anthem at hockey games. Like this is like, I think, fundamentally weird. I think this is not what Trump campaigned on at all. And the fact that he seems to think or believe, or at least be willing to try to get Americans psyched to like want to fight Canada, is that a winning message for Republicans in 2026? Is there a groundswell of people throughout the country who are like, have always hated Canada and like, yeah, why do we let them sell us electricity? Like it's bizarre, isn't it? Like I hope I'm not overstepping that, but like, where does this even come from? This animus towards Canada? There are some legitimate debates about various tariff that they have on our dairy or whatever.
Oh yeah.
But the extrapolation of that to we're going to destroy the Canadian economy and take their land is like what are we even talking about here? Like it's like reminds me of playing like a video game or something, like where he's just trying to expand the board.
It's also incoherent because it's like we can't stand Canada. Canada is a terrible country, but also we want it. Give us the 51st state.
Right.
Krystal, speaking of that tweet, we wanted to put B5 up on the screen, or that Truth Social post, I should say. This is from the Times. Israel turns off Gaza electricity to force hostage release, which I think, Krystal, you were saying is quite an interesting juxtaposition with the Truth Social post of Donald Trump saying, can you imagine Canada stooping so low as to use electricity that so affects the lives of innocent people as a bargaining chip and a threat?
Yeah, I'm making the obvious just point about hypocrisy here and how there are no principles involved, right? It's all just whatever Trump wants to do in the moment. But I mean, there's a couple things to pick up on your point, Jeff, is like, I guess one way to read Trump's animus towards Canada is, he's long hated Trudeau. Trudeau's this kind of like Obama-like figure. Now the Liberals are led by this other like sort of, liberal technocrat type. He hates these certain European leaders also that he feels like are part of this democratic liberal order that look down their nose at him. So one of the ways to read this is just like this sort of like personal grievance and animus, which does seem to be an animating force for Trump. But then the other way to read it is in this broader context of, he really is doing this sort of like throwback colonial or at least, brazen empire building territory acquisition plan. If you take seriously we want to make Canada the 51st state, or at least we want to change the boundaries, we want Greenland, we want Panama, we want Gaza, we're just going to go and take the things that we want. We're going to go back to the Monroe Doctrine where we're going to throw our weight around. This is our backyard, et cetera. So, and maybe it's some of both, but that's kind of how I read it, is that this is part and parcel with that return to an older style of direct imperialism that isn't like the USAID, we're going to use our soft power, or the Chinese model of like the Belt and Road Initiative. It's like, no, we're actually going to take your land and mine your minerals and let our oligarchs like buy up the pieces of your country that are going to be valuable to them.
It's such a great point, Krystal. The way I think about it is that it's like simultaneously contingent and structural. Like I think about this a lot in the context of sort of what Musk is doing in the government, because on the one hand, it's clearly true that the Trump movement and Trump personally personifies an ideological sort of attack on the nonpartisan career civil service that Republicans have come to view with a great deal of suspicion and animus over the last, many years. That is a structural sort of force in American politics, which Trump is in the process of codifying and implementing. At the same time, Musk is sort of just one guy who, by all sorts of somewhat random reasons, ended up being a very sort of close ally of this president specifically, and through what certainly appears to be sort of contingent factors of place and time and what's going through one guy's head, ended up being put in charge of this effort that he's now sort of distinctively supercharged with his own, fingerprints in a way that is genuinely different, I think, than what the standard bog Republican would have done to the federal government in a second Trump term anyway, right? Like Musk is doing that differently than Trump would have if Musk had never come around. And so, yeah, I think you're describing it well, where it's simultaneously these underlying structural factors that may even supersede Trump in many ways. Like there was an interesting piece over the weekend by a conservative writer whose name I'm forgetting, sort of about how we might be in this we had this post-World War II era where our entire politics was defined by sort of this liberal international order viewed as with its sort of most important goal to avoid the sort of territorial acquisitiveness that Hitler defined. I'm not comparing Trump to Hitler. I'm just saying that the world order that was built after World War II seems to be crumbling. And maybe that's not even a Trump-specific or Trump-dependent phenomenon, but the fact that Trump is executing it has given it sort of a Trump distinctive, and as to your point about individuals, a Trump distinctive flavor and approach.
That's so interesting, Jeff. Thank you for coming on to break this down. It was you must have been just on a swivel all day yesterday with your reporting. It was such a roller coaster. So thank you for helping the rest of us catch up to speed.
No, thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
Great to see you, Jeff. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.